Welcome to this webinar, the Heat and Building Strategy, Reflections on the Policy. I am Thomas Lane, the Technical Editor of Building Magazine. The government published its long-awaited Heat and Building Strategy at the end of last month, with 23% of the UK's carbon emissions coming from heating Britain's 30 million buildings. Reducing this is central to meeting the 2050 net zero carbon target. The idea was the strategy would set out how to reduce these emissions using a basket of measures, including fabric improvements, heat pumps, hydrogen and heat networks. The expectation was this would be driven by incentives and a degree of regulation, coupled with improvement targets and the details of how to upgrade buildings at a national scale, including how to train enough people up to do the work. So, today I'm joined by three experts to discuss to what extent the heat and building strategy will deliver against the government's targets and what it means for the industry. So our experts are David Pinder, who is the chair of the Green Construction Board and also a Construction Leadership Council member, Ben Harris, who is UK Sustainability and Climate Change Director at Arcadis, and Oliver Jones, the Research Director at Ryder Architecture. We were going to be joined by Kate Doherty from WSP, but unfortunately she can't make it. So the format of today's sessions will be, you will hear from each of our three speakers in turn, and then we will discuss the points that are raised. And you, the audience, have got an opportunity to ask a question. You can ask a question anytime just by typing it into your browser. You can do that during the presentations, or you can wait until after the presentations. And these will form the discussion points for any time remaining after the presentations are finished. So anyway, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to David Pinder for his presentation. So thank you very much, David.
Thanks, Thomas. Just wait for the presentation to load.
It's all there. I think you're good to go.
Oh, I can't see it. I can't see it. That's odd, isn't it? Sorry, I can still only see the three of us.
Right, strange, because I've got. Can Ben and Oliver? Can you see the presentation?
Yes, I can see it. Yes.
Right.
David, if you just put down the cameras, you should be able to see it behind, maybe.
Apologies. I can anyway. I can run it from. I will run it from my own presentation, and if you can all see it, that's fine. So we'll just do it that way. Okay, fine. So thanks for the invite. My name is David Pinder. I am the chair of the Green Construction Board and executive chair of Mixergy. That's my day job. So the Green Construction Board is the sustainability arm of the Construction Leadership Council, of which I'm also a task force member. Mixergy is a relatively young company which was spun out of Oxford University. It's a scale-up company with some really interesting technology relating to smart cylinders. But today I'm addressing you with my GCB hat on. So if I could go to the next slide, please. I always wanted to say that. So the way I've structured the presentation today is really in three parts. So looking at the parts of the heat and building strategy that we like in the GCB, the bits that we don't like quite as much, and then also listing some of the actions that we think need taking in addition to the heat and building strategy. So just kicking off with what we like, the bit at the top in the box is the most important bit because those are the firm commitments and funding. So we're really pleased to see a reconfirmation, an extension of funding going to the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, and also towards fuel poverty through the HUGS scheme over the next 3 years. The SHDF in particular we like because it seems to approach things in the right way. So it's fabric first. It deals with the properties with the worst conditions first, and goes for lowest regret interventions, those that won't need further intervention again before 2050. And it deals with clean heat only where appropriate, once the energy efficiency of the building has been brought up to a level where it can support low temperature heating systems such as heat pumps. Furthermore, it's establishing a social housing retrofit accelerator, which we think is really important, acting as a repository for best practice and also as a support for local authorities to help them to get on with the job of decarbonisation. Really keen as well to see and pleased to see government taking the lead with its own public buildings, with funding of nearly £1.5 billion over the next 3 years, and some investment in innovation around heat pumps. Now, although 60 million is relatively modest in the context of the R&D funds of many of the heat pump organisations that already exist, it certainly will be helpful for startup scale companies wanting to enter the sector with new innovative ideas. So big supporter of that as well. And outside of domestic, looking at minimum performance standards of EPC-B by 2028 is a good step forward. And finally, coming around to the idea of having a performance-based measurement scheme for commercial buildings, again, a really positive step. I think one of the things that I absolutely will credit BEIS with is they've been extremely open to consultation throughout the whole process of writing the heat and building strategy, and the door seems to be wide open for further consultation, mostly around using minimum standards, EPCs to drive change, but nonetheless, really wide open door from BEIS. So inviting industry to consult further on a number of different items. Important to say as well that in the heat and building strategy, hydrogen hasn't been forgotten, although there is a sense of a bit of kicking of the can down the road, with no real meaty decisions being taken before 2026 on the role of hydrogen. We could talk about blended hydrogen well before that, I think, as well as hydrogen-ready boilers. And a commitment to address distortions on fuel prices, which sounds good in principle, but I think we'd like to see the detail on that. Next slide, please. What we're less keen on in the heat and building strategy is the gaping hole around the owner-occupier sector. I politely said it's not adequately addressed. And my sense is, having spoken to BEIS, that they recognise that. And I think the feeling is that it's a lack of political will rather than a lack of understanding about the importance of this sector and the need to address it with policy. And that's really due to, and this is my view of the government's view on decarbonisation of owner-occupier homes, but my sense is that they believe that the taxpayer shouldn't pay and that a high degree of customer choice needs to be preserved. So that makes it difficult to regulate. So I understand what BEIS are up against. So I think what that means is we have to take an industry lead on this, which is something we could talk about. So really disappointing that there's no funding in place for a national retrofit strategy. That was a strategy that was recommended by the Construction Leadership Council and was also included in the trajectories of the UK GBC industry-wide whole life carbon route map as being absolutely fundamental for us to deliver net zero by 2050 in the built environment. So without that national retrofit strategy or a programme of work that delivers what that sought to achieve, then we won't get to net zero by 2050 in the built environment. It just isn't achievable because of the size of the challenge within the owner-occupier sector. What we do see is funding for a boiler upgrade scheme, which I was pleased to see money being put forward in this way. However, our view is that it's not enough. It's poorly funded. It subsumes the 4K upfront clean heat grant that had already been announced, which in turn was replacing the renewable heat incentive. But really the biggest problem is that this is being offered to homeowners out of the context of a holistic home retrofit plan, which should be based on fabric first. So our concern there is that middle and high income families that are benefiting from the scheme might be very disappointed at the end of it if they end up with a low temperature heating system that isn't performing adequately in winter because they've still got a leaky house. And indeed, at the end of the exercise, their fuel bill goes up instead of down because the coefficient of performance of the heat pump is not high enough to accommodate the spark gap, the difference in pricing between gas and electricity. So that just seems sort of set up for disappointment. And we feel the money could be better spent on retrofitting on a fabric first basis. There's a real concern that there's an over-reliance on heat pumps as a solution. I understand the attraction of that, but it isn't the panacea. The economic case, frankly, isn't compelling even with grants, unless there's a significant rebalancing of pricing of electricity versus gas. And the prospect for cost reductions for the installation of heat pumps, I fear, has been significantly exaggerated. And as I've said already, we need to make sure that we're only putting low temperature heating systems into well insulated homes. And there's a danger that that won't happen. There was one other feature of the heat and building strategy that's worth mentioning, and that was a consultation around a market mechanism where manufacturers would be obliged to supply low carbon heating. Not necessarily a problem with that as a concept, and pleased to see it's going through consultation, but it does seem a little bit harsh on the manufacturers who have to discharge that obligation. My experience of that when I was CEO of Baxter Heating is that it was a race to the bottom. So discharging obligations just becomes an exercise in reducing margins rather than costs. That is being put at the door of the manufacturers at a time when they'll be footing the bill for retraining many of the people that will do the installation and maintenance work. So we probably need more than 100,000 gas engineers to retrain as heat pump engineers if we're to deliver the government's targets of 600,000 heat pump installs a year by 2028. So next slide, please. So what else do we think that we need to do? Absolutely critical is the nationwide retrofitting of existing homes. We do need to establish a national home retrofit program based on fabric first. We need to make homes efficient, warm, and use that to facilitate a transition away from fossil fuel heating. I think we could build on the social housing retrofit accelerator model that we will see established with the funding of the SHDF, and use that to create a knowledge hub to deliver support to retrofit coordinators, installers, and end users. I think we need to, if we're going to rely on EPCs, we need to see a reform of EPCs, and hopefully that's in the offing anyway. And we ought to be introducing a minimum EPC rating for all homes at point of sale way earlier than 2035, and we're recommending 2028. And we might want to consider the removal of VAT on energy efficient retrofit building works and direct grants for low income households to address their retrofit challenge. Next slide, please. And finally, looking outside of the domestic housing stock, we need energy performance disclosure for non-domestic buildings. We need to make the carbon visible, measure it, and then treat it. We ought to look at adopting a design for performance approach to new buildings, where we're looking at the energy usage intensity of those buildings and maybe put demand limits on space heating. And then finally, we need to address whole life carbon measurement, because although that's a relatively small proportion of our emissions at the moment, I think it's less than 10%, as we progress and address energy in use and emissions in use, embodied carbon will become eventually the biggest contributor proportionately of emissions within the built environment. So we need to start measuring it, and we need a mechanism for addressing it. So that was my canter through the heat and building strategy from the perspective of the Green Construction Board, and more than happy to take questions either now or later.
Great. Well, excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, David, for your presentation. I mean, we'll go on to our next presentation, but before we do that, just a quick question from me, really. I mean, obviously, the criticality of the national retrofit strategy, you've made that very clear in your presentation. And the fact that, you also said that bays are actually quite open. We've got a really open door. I mean, do you see, okay, it hasn't happened now, but do you see maybe that national retrofit strategy getting incorporated into government thinking at any point in the future, and that being used as a basis for retrofitting the UK's existing buildings?
The feedback I got from BEIS on the topic was that they believe that the thinking that sits behind the national retrofit strategy, you can find embedded in the heat and building strategy. It's sort of scattered through it, but what you don't see is any funding. So the principles that sit behind the national retrofit strategy have been adopted by BEIS, and they're very open about that. But the strategy per se, as a vehicle for delivery, hasn't been funded. And so the question is, what do we do next? I mean, how do we take that forward? And I think it's going to be incumbent on industry now to pick up the challenge. But then there'll be a question of how do we fund it privately? So I think we'll have to put together a task force and then come knocking on government's door to say, actually, we've already established the body that's going to help with the leadership and with the advice and the mechanisms for getting things moving. Now, will you give us ministerial support?
Right, I see. Right. So the industry will sort of take the initiative again, which is really good. Well, I hope that that works. So thanks very much, David. So I'm going to move on now to our next speaker, who is Ben Harris from Arcadis. So over to you, Ben.
Thank you, and thank you, David. That was brilliant. What I went through the strategy, it's very difficult to follow. I suppose I'll start with a little, maybe a reflection on the last few weeks. I was fortunate enough to just go up to Glasgow for a couple of days, and with COP going on, and just thinking about the agreements that were made there. And I suppose we're less than a week away from that now. We're also sort of 2 years into the decisive decade, and we're sort of 29 years from the point where we think that we need to decarbonize the global economy to keep 1.5 degrees alive. And I suppose the heat and building strategy does fit within that context. And if we can go to the next slide, I think it's interesting, really, just reflecting on what COP26 has been for the UK as a lightning rod, really, for these types of strategies to come out. We have seen, but also I think the movement of business and the general public in terms of their expectations in terms of this agenda. The environment continues to be. I think there was a YouGov poll that it still continues to be in the top 3 of priorities for the public, and so that pressure does continue. I think on the government and on business to react to the need to tackle particularly the challenges around climate change. So we have seen these three of the strategies, including the net zero carbon strategy, which sort of brings the different things together, and the adoption of the government's 6th carbon budget. And I suppose within that, that we've now got this target of a 78% reduction by 2035. And actually, just reflecting on the sort of the wider context of that, my daughter is 5, and I suppose by the time she potentially leaves the home, then we're not going to have any fossil fuels in our electricity production. We're not going to be able to buy petrol and diesel cars, and hopefully with this strategy, we potentially will be doing the right things around improving the fabric of our buildings and ripping out our boilers and putting in heat pumps. So there is this change, I suppose, that is going on, and from my reflection of the strategy, I suppose the government is placing this within that context of that systems change and that systems innovation. type approach. I spent time working with in the European body IT Climate Kick, where we looked at developing innovation for climate action, or climate innovation, as it were. A lot of time the organization did look at that technology push and driving the sort of concepts around early startup and engagement around that, and move to a role in more in the demand creation side of things. And I suppose this strategy is looking at that within sort of stimulating the market. So I suppose is and the question around the technology that is ready to deploy. I suppose the question from the government is through modest stimulation, will that create the competition and economies of scale? I don't know if we could go to the next slide. But I echo, David, what you said. I mean, in terms of some of the things, will this go far enough? There is a bet on the future rather than necessarily a certain outcome, and actually it's reflecting on will this stimulation get us to where we need to be? It's interesting, sort of, I suppose, reflecting on that and UK context within this wider piece around COP26, and I suppose the UK's role within global decarbonisation. Do we have an opportunity to stimulate markets and be part of that group that are looking at bringing down those costs of key technologies and engaging that around the world? We've seen costs come down in wind and solar. We are seeing that in electric vehicles, and I suppose we really need to see that cost curve in and the kind of models that will help us do that with heating and insulating our homes. Ultimately, we do want the UK to be part of that. I suppose that global scaling of this technology. David, you pointed out a number of challenges, and I think that one of those is around the skills. This is one of the things that we're trying to do. In the strategy, the government points out that there's an opportunity for 240,000 new building-related jobs within this sector. Also points out that the low carbon economy can support 2 million jobs. There's a lot of training and development that needs to happen. We do need to enable people to work within the context of these new technologies, but also sort of take advantage of where these new opportunities are coming from. And will the sums be enough in an inflationary market? For all businesses to commit and achieve the economies of scale that the government is looking for. But we also need to think about the people in this, in terms of those that are going to be using it as part of the solution. We know from studies that actually what people's homes are, the fabric of people's homes, and how they fit within particularly the climate change agenda is moving up their priorities. But still, people want homes that get the basics right. They want heating that works first time. They want and all the time, and they want technology that they understand. I reflect on the last stimulus that was put in place from the government for this. At that time, actually, my mum looked to get a heat pump. She went online. She tried to find somebody to do it. She couldn't. But also, reflecting on her views of, actually, she didn't know anybody who had a heat pump. She didn't know anybody, again, who could install it. And it's actually understanding what it is that that people have to think about when they are trying to adopt these new technologies, and making sure that we bring people with us. So if we go on to the next slide, I think what will make it work? Well, I don't know, just a few reflections, I suppose. Is that we do need to show people how it works and practically, and we will need to engage that with people within the centre of that. I think when we've got multiple initiatives like this going on, and we're still also stimulating different parts of the economy, particularly when we're trying to look at markets to lead this, we do need to understand what the impact is. We do need to be in a position to learn fast, scale what works and drop what doesn't. And I think this will require collaboration as well as competition to move at the speed that we need. We will need to use funding and legislative drivers as a catalyst to encourage more private finance. So for me, I suppose the heat and building strategy sets out a framework for stimulating this systems change, but we will need to keep checking in to know how if it is working. And as David has set out in a number of occasions, we need to understand how we as a sector are going to own this challenge and support to take it forward. And thank you.
Great. Well, thanks very much indeed, Ben. That was a very interesting presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to Oliver now, who is going to talk about some of the unintended consequences of more airtight homes, and also he's right away engaged in a demonstration project. He's going to talk about that. So over to you, Oliver.
Thanks, Tom. Fantastic presentations. I thought I'd take a little bit of a different tack when preparing for this, preparing these reflections, and try to put forward some constructive provocations, I suppose, on the strategy and on what's to come. I think a key question is around the strategy itself, and is it the right approach? Nobody is yet to deal with the complexity of the problem in my eyes, or addressing those unintended consequences or impacts that occur when you focus on proposing solutions in isolation without understanding the further unintended consequences and the impacts of those decisions. So if I was being exceedingly cynical, which isn't like me, I would probably say that the proposals at best, to me, upon going through them with a fine-tooth comb, it's great that here we can take a very positive view of it, but in parts they're incomplete for me, and at worst, if I was being very cynical, I'd say that they may be a bit partisan. I think we need to understand that through our inaction and our underinvestment, we've created a problem of such magnitude with so many interdependencies that are all interconnected and have so many interconnected impacts that we can't really now afford to look at even a huge topic like heat in buildings in isolation as a specific problem that we need to address. Otherwise, we set in motion potentially another slow motion car crash that literally costs the earth and doesn't take into account the broader context or those interdependencies that I've mentioned. So, the construction sector is made up of predominantly small businesses, self-employed, a large contingent of self-employed who've done things in a particular way for a very long time, using the same materials, the same processes, and taking an approach like we have here to stimulate the market to provide a response will absolutely generate solutions, but these solutions will be of varying quality. They will likely be underfunded, they'll be under-researched, and they'll carry significant unintended consequences, in my opinion. Most of all, my fear is that they're unlikely to be scalable and deliverable at the rate that we need. So that leads me on to thinking about, well, the leadership, the finance, and more long-term strategy around that. And for an individual thought-leading, pioneering business that's looking to address the breadth of the challenge that's ahead of us at scale and at speed, it's a bit like turning the Titanic for that business. For the sector to address this, and it's like trying to simultaneously turn a fleet of 1,000, each plotting their own course individually to a set of crude coordinates. So I absolutely think that we need more substantial oversight. We need to work towards that regulation. And importantly, we need leadership to do this in order to do this at speed and at scale. We're incredibly innovative as a sector, and we will absolutely, as I've said, generate those solutions. But we need a whole framework that's wrapped around this for rapid testing and certification, for climate adaptation planning, which is something that's potentially a real issue, and supporting supply chains, and importantly, as mentioned, skills and training and the rollout of skills and training. And I absolutely agree with David's points around the need for the national retrofit strategy and a more holistic plan around this. So I've talked about the consequences of unintended consequences like some sort of spectre on the horizon, but the truth is they're already here. we're improving the thermal efficiency of our homes, which tends to mean that we're insulating them more. In many cases, this means making them more airtight and potentially moving towards reliance on mechanical heat and ventilation over the coming decades. And there are a few unintended consequences on the horizon here. For me, you know, one of them is around internal air quality. It's 5 times worse than external air quality, research has shown. And this is a huge issue nationally with well-documented health impacts. One report has been shown for the UK to be losing 500,000 school days a year due to respiratory problems caused by poor indoor air quality. If you add to this the knock-on effects of a parent having to be home, and you know the long-term and short-term effects of that are quite significant. And then we've got external air quality, and introducing external air to improve our internal air quality is a great idea, but it doesn't work if our external air is equally terrible. And you know, there's a lot of issues with high particulate matter. Our partners in our Vancouver offices, we're already seeing this in their homes at scale now, the impacts of this through the number of wildfires that are going on through over the world. So it's very easy to blow this out of scale and out of proportion, but I absolutely believe that it relies on understanding the fundamental interconnectedness between a lot of these things. You know, so say we create super insulated homes, you know, intermittently and quickly without a broader strategy or plan to account for the broader unintended consequences, or planning for climate adaptation. You know, another thing is if we don't start significantly greening our neighborhoods and our urban centers with extensive urban tree planting projects, you might say, well, what the hell has this got to do with heat and building strategy? But it's an absolutely fundamental part. You know, we need them now in order to mitigate future increased flooding, introduce intelligent rainwater management, and plan for how we might address urban heat islands in the future, and likely suburban heat islands, which will become more commonplace. Again, we're seeing instances of this all over the world in terms of the issues that neighborhoods and people are facing. So these things are really, really easy to label as out of scope in reports like this. But they're clearly interrelated, and to not address them, I think, is failing to challenge the real issues. You know, again, it's worse, it's naive. At its best, it's kicking the can even further down the road. So they're my views around the unintended consequences. I think very quickly, talking about advanced materials and the role that advanced materials have to play in this. You know, we do an awful lot of work with startups, helping to get their advanced materials tested, certified, and into pilot projects. And I think they've got a huge role to play in the future of retrofit. Some really, really exciting opportunities. We're working with a company called Thermulon, who've developed a fire-safe insulation based on waste glass, and another company called Sphera that's developed a carbon negative block that has a high thermal performance. So these technologies, these materials are coming through, but I can't help but ask, are we being ambitious enough in the sort of the framework and the leadership that we're trying to show and set out in how we implement them? You know, we're looking towards reinforcing the same consumer models that we've created, which I think can only really lead to increasing energy costs over time. You know, I'd love to see us move towards more local, decentralized, renewable energy, microgrids, and really start to address that generational fuel poverty that's been handed down to different regions throughout the country. And you know, I want my kids to see a future where we've ingrained culture and behaviors that support zero waste, and where we've also got energy that is either low cost or no cost, and low carbon and local at the same time. So I think the only way we can really do that is through deep demonstrator projects. These, you know, the things I've mentioned on Pie in the Sky, they're happening in pockets all up and down the country. They're happening in pockets internationally. And I just think there's an opportunity here to be much more ambitious with the strategy that we're setting out, and the framework that we're setting out upon, and to ask some really critical questions of, is this the right approach, reinforcing that sort of traditional consumer model, or is there another way to do it? So that's enough provocation from me, Tom.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Oliver. So basically, that's the end of the formal presentation. So we're now going to discuss some of the points that have been raised. So again, I'd encourage our audience to submit any questions. So actually, I've got a first question which actually relates to your presentation, Oliver. So it relates to this standard PAS 2035, which is a standard which has been drawn up with the idea that a home can be assessed for its energy use, for the construction, a deep understanding of that home, and also which would include the sort of improvements that could be made to reduce its energy use, a kind of plan for the home, if you like, and the idea being that this doesn't have to be all done at once, it can be done over a period of time. But the speaker is the question is actually, do you think that the application of PAS 2035 could actually help reduce those unintended consequences which you talk about?
I absolutely do, and I don't want to come across too cynical in what the strategy is trying to do, the heat and building strategy is trying to do. I think it all helps. I do worry that from, echoed through the other two presentations that we've had today, that framework for finance is in the wind at the minute. It's where's it coming from, and how's it going to be funded? And it sits a little bit uncomfortably, putting a lot of the emphasis of our achieving this on the owners of homes, when I think that it rings very much like the big oil developing the carbon footprint conversation. It's all up to you guys. You've got to do it. You've got to fix your homes. It'll be all right. I think there needs to be an awful lot more funding opened up, investment, focus on measurement and performance, as David and Ben have both discussed. And I worry that we're getting lost in a myriad of headlines and numbers that actually aren't really resulting in any real change or demonstration of what's possible.
Okay. Does anyone else like to comment on this at all before we move on to the next question?
Just to build on what Oliver said, I mean, the PAS 2035 was one of the building blocks of the National Retrofit Strategy, actually, along with Trustmark. So making sure that people do have that plan to see over time how they can improve their homes in the right sequence, doing the right things first, and not prejudicing future improvements by improvements they've made historically. So having that plan laid out, that they can do it in one go or they can do it in several steps, I think that's key, and absolutely support that, and making sure it's done to the right standards, because I think part of the problem with our home improvements is that there's a legacy of poor quality work. I mean, I not across the whole industry or industries, but there is always a consumer concern about will the job be done well? So I think things like Trustmark are important, as is PAS 2035. So big tick on both of those.
And I suppose also, in the way that it supports funding decisions and the way to flow funding into situations where it's needed.
Okay. That's a big question for you all now. So, I mean, the heat and building strategy talks a lot about EPCC ratings for owner-occupied homes. And it seems to be sort of generally branded around that EPCC is the kind of thing to go for. I know a lot of the social housing programs as well are going for EPCC. However, the London Energy Transformation Initiative, in the same week that the heat and building strategy was published, they put out their plan for retrofit, and it included 3 standards that people should be aiming for when they retrofit their homes. And now these standards are much, much tougher than EPCC, and I understand the shortcomings of the way EPCs are sort of measured, but essentially what they were calling for was as a kind of best case you know, the ideal scenario was anything, which is basically the passive house equivalent for retrofit. And the middle kind of scenario was better than current building regulations. This is for existing homes, and the kind of constrained scenario, which is for listed buildings and the like, was not much less than that. Now, given that I think there's quite a big gap between these two sort of approaches, I'm interested to know from the panel whether going for EPCC is actually, we're not being ambitious enough, because perhaps a bit further down the line we'll realise that actually EPCC ratings don't really do it, and we need to kind of do the whole process again. We're going to have to again do all the work all over again. But what's your view?
Where do you want to start, Tom?
Well, you can start, Oliver.
You could argue about the way EPCs are calculated and the performance gap, and therefore what does C mean anyway? Because unless we're actually measuring energy in use, we don't know what we've achieved. So it's kind of a nebulous measure. Then you can talk about, once you've finally started to measure it correctly, what standard do you need to achieve? And do you have to achieve it in one go? It's a bit back to the you know, the whole house refurbishment plan that you need. So you could do it in steps, and C might be a step on the route map, provided you haven't made a change that you wouldn't have made because it gets in the way of the next step, or that it's more expensive because you didn't do it in one go, and so on. But yeah, stepping stones towards the eventual correct position of retrofit, which it will be in that range that Letty put in their retrofit guide. You can follow stepping stones en route, but don't forget that we need to do most of it in the next 10 years. So if we're to hit our net zero targets, we need to get on with it. So kicking the can down the road doesn't help either.
No, absolutely. I particularly agree.
Yeah, and I suppose, Oliver, to your point, that, you know, actually, if we do that and we put those standards in place, do we then have the support and the approach behind it that enables people to actually do that? We need to check in as to whether those things are working and we are getting the right level of stimulation cost point, and is actually the market shifting in response to that. Yeah, we probably need to move on both, and we probably need to move on both. Well, yeah, but David, within the next 10 years, it is very much time is upon us.
Just on EPCC, I think best we've got at a point in time, and actually I really, you know, I thank God for Letty and the like in terms of constantly pushing the envelope and being ambitious in the targets that they're pushing the industry and the sector to achieve, because it's got to come from somewhere.
Yeah, they're doing sort of a very good job, aren't they? Sort of really changing the industry's approach. I'm going to move on to something else, another topic. So again, the heat and building strategy talks about the role of hydrogen, and a decision is going to be made by 2026 on really how far we go with hydrogen. I mean, do you think this could be a pretty useful tool, particularly with hard to treat homes where heat pumps are not going to work, and maybe the disruption cost of retrofitting is too great, that maybe hydrogen boilers could be the way forward?
More than happy to comment, guys, if someone else doesn't want to. So, I mean, the issue with hydrogen is you have to treat every appliance in every building in a given geography. So if you convert the network to hydrogen, you've converted the network to hydrogen. So you change everything. So you can't sort of pick and choose along the road which houses have heat pumps and which houses have hydrogen boilers. Well, you can switch off the hydrogen, I suppose. But the point is that it's really the sort of strategy that will address you know, an urban area at a time. It's that sort of approach to life. Interestingly, blending in 20% hydrogen into methane is something that I believe most existing boilers can accommodate. I mean, they're all tested to 20% hydrogen blend anyway, but only on a sort of punctual basis, not on a running over time basis. So it should be relatively straightforward. I'll allow those that know more about the technical aspects of it to comment, but that shouldn't be beyond our capability to blend in 20% hydrogen. Moving to 100% hydrogen is a much more challenging matter. I mean, in terms of the boiler itself, you change the burner, that's not too difficult, but you've got to distribute it, you've got to generate it. And at the moment, there isn't enough hydrogen to even blend in the 20%, and it will cost more than natural gas. So you've got a supply side issue, you've got a cost issue, and you've got a point of use issue, all of which could be addressed, but it's a huge challenge.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, we will need hydrogen within the mix of decarbonisation, and
I agree.
And so and you're right, David. I suppose it's how we address that, and if in addressing other areas, particularly around industrial processes, possibly some areas of transport, then do we then does the technology come to a point where it's viable as an alternative in heating? The question is does that happen quick enough? Some of those other roadmaps are a little bit further away than what we're looking at with heating. So I think you know, hydrogen is part of the mix. I suppose there is this decision point around 2026, but it's kind of for me, I've had many discussions with people about it, arguing both sides very vehemently that it'll be one or the other. I mean, you know, we still will have to do things to the electricity grid. It's not going to be a complete switch over just to be able to do that from electric heating. So we will have to invest, and it's about my view, it will be about the price point and where the price comes on hydrogen. We will invest in it because we will need that as a solutions part of the mix. It's whether it comes to a point when we end up using it large scale heating.
Not being an expert on hydrogen at all, I think this points to something else around the heat and building strategy, which is that there's a absolutely monumental emphasis on housing and residential buildings in the strategy, which I totally understand. But it's about looking at the wider landscape, political and construction sector, and understanding that I'll jump a bit here, but we have horrendous steel production facilities in this country. They're all, the majority, in fact, nearly all of them are blast furnace steel plants. And actually, if there's already talk around ring fencing some hydrogen to convert those, you've got to look at the plans that are being put on the table across all of these different areas and think, well, hang on a minute, how does that work then with moving towards potentially understanding hydrogen in homes and where that hydrogen is going to come from? And it seems like a lot of natural barriers are being put into the place. Well, obviously we can't do the hydrogen in homes because we're waiting for hydrogen supply to reach a particular level. And all of these things, I think one of the things David mentioned, which I totally echo, is it feels uneasy putting all of our eggs into one basket for me personally. And there's an opportunity ahead of us now over the coming years with increased investment in research and innovation and the development of new technologies to test out and trial some of these different renewable energies and different networks of energy and heat.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to another question now, which is to do with really, I guess, how we sort of get owner-occupiers to improve their homes. I mean, owner-occupied homes have the lowest EPC ratings of all home types. Social housing is actually better. Yeah. So how we actually address that is a big challenge. So I guess this is a big question, and I have got a question which asks specifically around the green financing and maybe adjusted stamp duty, but also mixed in with this, of course, the able to pay market as well. Is really, I suppose, how do we get, the big question would be, how do we get the owner-occupier market to do something about the performance of their homes when you're looking at all the options available as green financing, this kind of compulsory EPC minimum ratings, as stamp duty incentives. What's the panel's view on that?
Well, I'm a supporter. I think trigger points and variable rates of stamp duty make sense, because I don't want to say this in an absolute way, but many owner-occupiers, when they move home, are making a choice to do so. And built into that choice will be the variable cost of the stamp duty. And if that variable cost includes an element for upgrading the fabric of the building into which they're moving, then they're doing that with their eyes open, in the knowledge that they're going to have to fund that bill. So I know that's not universally true. Sometimes people have to move house for other reasons, but to try and link it with a choice about moving property, so you've got a trigger point, I think does make sense. And personally, and I think the GCB would line up behind me on that, we're supporters of that approach.
Okay, thank you. Ben, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it is a challenge at the moment, because it's not I suppose one of those things that are high up the list of things that people make decisions about. As I understand it, you know, studies have said that it is moving up the agenda, but you know, still doesn't come to the top really. And you know there is still in the sort of purchase in people's minds is very much the Victorian Georgian home that perhaps would need a bit of work done to get it up to standard. So there does need to be something else in the mix for us to achieve some of the things within the owner-occupier market. Yeah, it's but it's I think there will be a swathe of measures that will sort of get people to do this. We'll see different costs in terms of heating, particularly around gas. We may see that have a stimulus if prices come down. That may sort of also support things. But yeah, at the moment, the decision to move is made on other areas, and so maybe it does need to come to the fore with something else.
Oliver, do you have any views on this topic?
Yeah, I think just going back to David's point, I know we've qualified it in. There's a real opportunity of us leaving people behind potentially in the way that this works, and it's absolutely fantastic that there's been all of those announcements around the social housing decarbonization fund, but in real, to 800 million is fantastic, but it's a drop in the ocean in terms of what we need to retrofit that social housing. And you worry that a lot of the pointers around having a housing retrofit plan, all of the other elements are focused on those who can and those who likely will, because they have the means to do so. So I think that the best way to try to convert people, to change culture, to change behaviours, lies in data and benchmarking and performance metrics, and building a case around this, and building a clear case that's backed up with scientific evidence that says this is going to save you X amount of money, this is going to save X amount of carbon, and this is the and we don't really have our house in order with regards to that level of data collation yet. We'd like to look across nationally and see things like the National Digital Twin Programme maybe focus in a bit more on just energy consumption and operational energy use of buildings. That would be a fantastic thing to have as a country, as opposed to maybe taking a bit more of a broader approach of all these things that might be useful. Let's just focus on things like this huge national digital twin investment that's been going on around understanding operational energy data. So for me, it's data, performance, and benchmarking.
I mean, sort of allied to that, I mean, do you think that sort of if every home in the country was made them eligible for a free PAS 2035 assessment, that would make, you know, the whole point about awareness and education. People will then become aware of, you know, more aware maybe of actually how much energy they're actually using at the moment, but also the potential savings going further down the line. I mean, do you think that could be a useful approach?
it's trying to understand the quality and the pitfalls in that approach, Thomas. So you can already see the way that potentially could play out. You get a visit, you get a survey done of your home. Apparently, you need all of this new work done. It reinforces a broken model, in my view, of the way that we retrofit our homes to some extent. And I'm not taking a punch at the retrofit housing planner. What I'm taking an issue with is the way that we might implement it as a society. And I think we've got to be really careful with how it gets implemented. We've got to have the right kind of people doing the assessing. They're properly skilled, educated and trained. A lot longer than, as David's pointed out, a lot longer than a week on whacking a heat pump in a new property. I think that there's a massive skills shortage in the retrofit space that cannot be underestimated.
Yeah, I mean, the skills thing is obviously a big challenge. I mean, actually on that point, skills, I mean, is this something that the industry should be responsible for? Do you think the government really should take the lead here, and there should be government funded sort of I don't know, even dedicated colleges set up to get people to train, or in the case of the heat pump sort of training, it's been left to manufacturers. Actually, manufacturers are doing it at the moment. Obviously, it's not their core business, and there's only so much capacity there. Should the government take over? I mean, David, you've got a sort of background in this area. What's your view on this? I think you're mute.
Classic. Well done. When it comes to building on existing skills, I think that's okay. So the boiler manufacturers that are wanting to install heat pumps now will want to train their loyal installers to have those skill sets, but that really is probably 2 or 3 weeks training, in addition to the 3 years and lots of practical experience they've already accrued as gas safe engineers. But where are all the other heat pump installers going to come from that aren't already out there working as gas safe installers? So if you look at the time it takes to fit a heat pump, it probably takes 2 or 3 installers twice as long to install a heat pump as a boiler. And we've got 130,000 gas safe engineers installing about 1.5 million boilers a year. So if we're going to install 1 million heat pumps a year, how many heat pump engineers do we need to train? And is it going to be the gas safe engineers that quickly convert to being heat pump installers? Because if you look at the demographic of gas safe engineers, they are predominantly in their 50s and older. And it might be a time where they think, well, maybe I'll just take this opportunity to put down my tools and move on. So I think there is a requirement for government to do something through the colleges, through the institutes, to kickstart a program of training of, for example, heat pump installers. But we need to train retrofit assessors as well, and we need to, there'll be a whole bunch of different skills that are required in the green economy that the government's got to help to kickstart. It can't all be left to the manufacturers.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. And time as well. I mean, how long does it take, do you think, for someone to no knowledge at all to train up to someone from scratch to a competent heat pump installer? Is that sort of years?
I'm not an expert, Tom, but I would say 3 to 4 years of training and then a few years of practical experience. I mean, in the conversations I've had with the boiler manufacturers, what they're saying is they're only going to be training the best of their installers, because it's much more difficult, because you've got to take a whole system approach to the heat pump installation. So I think the thing that people forget is you're not just changing the heat source, you're changing the whole system. It's a low temperature heating system, so you need to do an assessment of the property room by room. You need to look at the emitters, you need to look at whether or not there's a hot water storage system, you need to look at whether there needs to be a buffer vessel introduced. You need to have a whole system approach to putting in a heat pump. I mean, it's a significant change from just putting in a high temperature boiler.
And you need to understand the insulation and how well insulated the boiler. It goes back to David's point around fabric first.
And then the impact on air quality and so on and so on. as Oliver's already said, there are so many unintended consequences of not doing it holistically. You simply have to take a holistic view.
Well, I think on that note, well, we're out of time actually, so I think it's a good point to finish. But I think, you know, this last point just demonstrates a sort of monumental scale of the challenge, and also the time as well. I mean, we've got 10 years, and it takes a minimum of 3 to 4 years to train to install a heat pump. It really kind of brings it home, and I think this is a subject that's going to clearly run and run and run. Hopefully not for too long. Hopefully we're going to get on a bit sooner rather than later. But on that note, I'd just like to say thanks very much to our panel for today's discussion. It's been really interesting, and thanks to our audience for listening. And if you want to hear the webinar again, it will be available to be downloaded. So thanks very much, everybody.
Pleasure.
Cheers.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys.
See you all. Thank you.